It's the dead of night in the cold winter of 1944, deep in the heart of the Ardennes forest. The war that has torn across Europe for 5 long years shows no sign of abating. A heavy silence hangs in the air, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery muffled by the dense trees. The air is thick with tension, as men on both sides of the conflict are too worn, too weary to be anything but alert, waiting for the next explosion, the next attack. It's the final days of the Battle of the Bulge, and what's left of the German forces are retreating in haste while the Americans press forward, determined to finish the job. Among the battlefield's wreckage lies an unlikely and often overlooked participant: nurses. Amid the chaos of war, while tanks roll and artillery shells explode in the distance, there is still a human side to this catastrophe, a side often overshadowed by the headlines of battle strategies and death tolls. The German nurses, young women who signed up to serve their country in the worst of circumstances, find themselves in a truly unprecedented situation. Their uniforms, stained and torn by the blood and sweat of war, contrast against the bright flash of gunfire in the distance. They stand as silent witnesses to the carnage unfolding around them. As dawn breaks over the smoke-filled horizon, the sounds of the battlefield grow louder. The German nurses are caught between the battlefield and their solemn duty. They have no control over the tides of war, only the ability to care for the wounded and the dying. There are no sides for them, no political alliances, only the patients in front of them, regardless of uniform or nationality. For the first time, they are faced with a new dilemma: how to react when American soldiers, weary and battle-scarred, thank them for their service. In these moments, amid the sounds of rifles and the cries of men in pain, these nurses are confronted with something no one on the front lines has been prepared for: compassion in the most unexpected form. As the American soldiers shuffle in to receive care, the air around them is thick with exhaustion. But amid all the horror of war, something extraordinary happens. The soldiers, some of whom have witnessed the brutalities of war firsthand, turn to the very people who once seemed their enemies and offer their gratitude. In the most unlikely of places, amidst the bombed-out buildings and shattered lives, this gesture becomes a rare moment of humanity. What was it that made the soldiers thank these nurses despite the ongoing conflict? What did it mean for the nurses, whose world had been defined by service to the wounded, to experience this moment of unexpected camaraderie? To understand this moment fully, we must first look at the wider context, the stakes of the war and the experiences of the individuals involved. The year is 1944, and the world is irrevocably scarred by the brutalities of a war that has engulfed every continent. The conflict is global in scale, with major theaters in Europe, Africa, the Pacific, and the Far East. What began as a struggle between ideologies, fascism and communism, democracy and totalitarianism, has descended into a fight for survival. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, have waged relentless aggression across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. In response, the Allied forces, spearheaded by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, have mobilized their immense resources to push back against the Axis expansion. By late 1944, the balance of power has started to shift. Germany, once a mighty force on the European continent, is beginning to feel the weight of its mistakes. The Allies have launched a series of successful offensives that have put the Axis powers on the defensive. In the east, the Soviet Union is making significant gains, pushing the German army back toward the heart of the Reich. To the west, American and British forces have liberated much of France, having executed Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings, in June 1944. However, despite these setbacks, Nazi Germany is far from surrendering. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launch a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest in an attempt to split the Allied forces and capture the critical port of Antwerp. This would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought by the American army during the war. The American forces, caught off guard by the surprise attack, are initially pushed back, but the Allies rally quickly. The battle rages for several weeks with brutal fighting and terrible losses on both sides. As tanks and infantry clash in the snow-covered forests, the fate of thousands of soldiers, many of them young men far from home, hangs in the balance. Among these men are the soldiers of the U.S. Army, advancing into enemy territory, wounded, exhausted, and desperate for victory. At the same time, the German nurses, many of whom are pressed into service as the war drags on, find themselves in the midst of the battle's aftermath. They are responsible for tending to the wounded from both sides of the conflict, facing the grim reality of the injuries caused by modern warfare, shrapnel wounds, gunshot injuries, burns, and more. Their medical training has been their shield against the horrors around them, but no amount of preparation can steel them for the sheer human cost of war. The soldiers, American, German, and others, are not merely facing physical wounds. The psychological toll of war is profound. Soldiers from both sides carry the burden of loss, the weight of their fallen comrades, and the scars of what they have done to each other. Yet it is in the midst of this devastation that the story takes an unexpected turn. When American soldiers find themselves under the care of the very nurses they had been fighting against, it becomes apparent that the divide between the enemies is not as absolute as it once seemed. In the sterile and impersonal world of military medicine, where efficiency is prized above all else, there is still room for empathy. The German nurses, trained to care for the wounded, are faced with soldiers who are desperate for comfort, not just medical treatment. As these soldiers lie in makeshift hospitals, surrounded by the stench of death and the sounds of the dying, the gesture of thanks is the last thing they expect. What drives the American soldiers to thank the very people who were once on the opposite side of the battle? It is the human impulse, an understanding that in the face of the overwhelming tragedy of war, there is something more important than victory, something that transcends uniforms, borders, and ideologies. And it is in this moment of humanity, amidst the bloodshed and chaos, that the soldiers and the nurses encounter something that war cannot destroy: respect for each other as fellow human beings. To understand the significance of this encounter, it is essential to grasp the full scope of the events leading up to it, the strategies, decisions, and consequences that created this unexpected moment. The horrors of war have a way of breaking down the barriers between combatants, and it is in these rare moments of connection that the true cost of conflict is revealed. The Battle of the Bulge, fought from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945, was a desperate gamble by the German military, an attempt to halt the advancing Allied forces and reclaim the initiative on the Western Front. It marked the final major offensive launched by Nazi Germany, and its failure would have lasting consequences for the outcome of the war. With the German army stretched thin on multiple fronts, Hitler's strategy was to split the Allied forces, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and sow confusion among the American and British forces. The stakes were high, and the Germans needed a decisive victory to regain the upper hand. The battle took place in the rugged, snow-covered Ardennes forest, a region that had been largely untouched by the previous fighting. The Germans, exploiting the element of surprise, launched a rapid assault, catching the Americans off guard. The 101st Airborne Division, along with other American units, found themselves in the thick of it, fighting not just for survival, but for the future of the war in Europe. As the Germans advanced, they used a mix of infantry, tanks, and artillery, pushing through American defenses and creating a bulge in the Allied lines. The American forces, initially unprepared for such an intense assault, were forced into a brutal defensive stance. The weather, with its freezing temperatures and heavy snow, further complicated the situation. Both sides were operating at a disadvantage, fighting in the dark of winter without proper supplies and surrounded by the dense forest. The Americans struggled to hold their ground, while the Germans, despite their initial success, were quickly running low on resources. In the face of this chaos, the battlefield became a test of endurance. Soldiers from both sides fought with relentless determination, driven by duty, fear, and a sense of desperation. For the American soldiers, the battle represented a final push to secure the liberation of Europe. For the Germans, it was a last-ditch effort to stave off defeat and protect their homeland from the advancing Allied forces. Amid this maelstrom of violence and destruction, the German nurses found themselves caught in a no-man's land of conflicting emotions. They were tasked with tending to the wounded, regardless of their nationality. Many of them had been trained in the art of medicine, but nothing could prepare them for the horrors they witnessed in the days that followed. The battlefield was not only a place of military tactics and strategies, it was a place where human lives hung in the balance, where soldiers of both sides found themselves confronting the same brutal reality. As the battle raged on, the German nurses were exposed to the grim aftermath of the fighting. They cared for American soldiers who had been severely wounded in the fierce clashes. The nurses, whose loyalty to their country had been unquestioned, now faced a profound dilemma: how to reconcile their role in the war with the humanity of the soldiers lying before them. Many of the American soldiers, their faces gaunt and bloodied, had been brought into the makeshift field hospitals, their lives hanging by a thread. For the nurses, each life they saved was an act of defiance against the cruelty of the war. And yet they were also faced with soldiers who were, in many ways just like them, people who had been thrust into this conflict, with no choice but to fight or be fought against. It was in these moments of tending to the wounded that something remarkable happened. As American soldiers lay in agony, many of them too weak to speak, they looked up at the German nurses with a sense of surprise and gratitude. Despite the fierce battles that had unfolded between them, these soldiers were not angry or vengeful. Instead, they offered thanks. In a world where enemies were dehumanized, where soldiers were conditioned to view each other as the other, this simple act of recognition was profound. For the nurses, this moment was a reminder of the thin line that separated them from the very soldiers they had once seen as adversaries. The emotional weight of the moment was not lost on them. They had been taught to care for the wounded, to place their duty above all else. But now, as they tended to these soldiers, they were confronted by the reality that in the end all soldiers were human, bound by the same fragility. The soldiers' gratitude was not just a thanks for medical care. It was a recognition of shared humanity in the face of war's dehumanizing forces. The Battle of the Bulge would ultimately end in a decisive victory for the Allies. The Germans, unable to sustain their offensive, were forced to retreat. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and it would be only a few months before the Allies would march into Berlin, bringing the war in Europe to its final chapter. But the battle's impact went beyond just military strategy. It marked a turning point for the soldiers on both sides, particularly in the way they viewed each other and the war itself. The psychological toll of the battle was immense. Soldiers who had fought fiercely, sometimes to the brink of exhaustion, found themselves grappling with the brutal realities of the war. The American soldiers, despite their victory, had seen their comrades fall in bloody combat. And the German soldiers who had fought to defend their homeland were now retreating, their dreams of victory dashed. Amid this chaos, the nurses, both German and American, became silent witnesses to the true cost of war. It was in this environment that the simple act of gratitude became a powerful statement, one that transcended national lines and military allegiances. The soldiers' thanks to the German nurses were not just words. They were a symbol of the possibility for compassion and humanity, even in the most brutal of circumstances. It was a reminder that in the end, no matter the uniform, soldiers on both sides of the conflict shared a common bond: the desire to survive, to heal, and to preserve the lives of those around them. As the smoke from the Battle of the Bulge dissipated, the war did not immediately fade into a quiet reflection. The Allied victory marked a critical turning point, but the consequences of the battle rippled far beyond the Ardennes. For the American forces, the victory reinforced their strategic dominance in Europe, setting the stage for the final push toward Nazi Germany. Yet for the German soldiers, those who had survived the brutal retreat, it was a stark reminder of the inevitable collapse of the Reich. Hitler's dream of an empire that spanned Europe was crumbling, and the realization that their defeat was imminent began to sink in, not only among the soldiers, but also within the general population of Germany. For the soldiers, the immediate aftermath of the battle was marked by exhaustion, both physical and psychological. Thousands had been wounded, and many more had died, leaving a legacy of grief and loss that would linger long after the war. The Allied forces, despite their victory, were not untouched by the brutal realities of war. They had pushed through under the most extreme conditions, fighting not just enemy soldiers but also the very elements themselves. The cold, the snow, the treacherous terrain, and the sheer scale of the losses had tested their resolve. Yet they emerged victorious, but not without scars. The human cost of war was not just measured in the number of casualties, but in the toll it took on the souls of those who fought. Many of the American soldiers who participated in the Battle of the Bulge would carry the mental and emotional wounds for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, then an unrecognized condition, would haunt them long after the war had ended. The German soldiers too faced their own demons, haunted by their roles in a war that was slowly unraveling. But amid the devastation, there were moments that stood as reminders of the potential for human kindness. The gratitude expressed by the American soldiers toward the German nurses marked a stark contrast to the usual dynamics of war. It was an act of humanity amidst inhumanity. While many soldiers would return home to celebrate their victories or grieve their losses, the nurses were left to reckon with a different reality. They had seen their world destroyed by the war, and now they had to navigate a post-war environment in a Germany that was left broken and divided. For the nurses, the aftermath was a time of deep reflection. What had been the point of it all? What could they take away from a war that had cost so much and given so little? For some, the gratitude they received from the American soldiers would be a small but significant part of their own healing process. In the grim realities of war, it was this fleeting moment of connection that might have provided them with a measure of hope. The soldiers, who had spent months or years fighting the enemy, were able to see beyond uniforms, beyond ideologies, and recognize the person in front of them. And for the nurses, it was an acknowledgement of their own humanity. It was a moment where they were not just medical practitioners, but people. People who, in the face of the worst circumstances, could offer something more than just care. They offered understanding, compassion, and even kindness when the world seemed determined to erase it. As the months and years passed, the significance of the American soldiers' gratitude would fade from the collective memory, buried under the weight of history. Yet for the individuals involved, the encounter remained a vivid memory. For the American soldiers, it was a lesson in empathy and the recognition of the shared suffering of all involved in the war. For the nurses, it was a reminder that, despite their roles in the conflict, they too had felt the sting of war and had been part of something greater than just the battle between nations. The impact of the Battle of the Bulge and the story of the nurses and soldiers serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war. It is easy to forget that behind every battle, every military strategy, and every victory, there are individuals who bear the weight of that conflict. The soldiers and nurses, caught in a world of violence and destruction, found a way to transcend their roles as enemies and recognize each other as human beings. In the larger context of the war, this moment was but a small gesture, an exception in a world defined by chaos and destruction. But for those who experienced it, it became a powerful symbol of the possibility of compassion, even in the darkest of times. The impact of this gesture was not limited to the battlefield. It was a reminder that even in the worst of times, there is still the potential for decency, for understanding, and for humanity. As the war continued, the lessons of the Battle of the Bulge would influence the way that soldiers and civilians alike viewed their role in the post-war world. The emotional scars left by the war would take years to heal, but the encounter between American soldiers and German nurses would remain a poignant reminder of the humanity that endured, even when everything else seemed lost. In the decades that followed, the world would remember the Battle of the Bulge not only for its military significance, but for the human moments that emerged from it. It would serve as a reminder that in every battle, in every war, there are moments where people can rise above their circumstances and show compassion for those on the other side. The war, in all its devastation, had offered a glimpse into what could be, the possibility for understanding and peace, even when victory seemed impossible. And so the legacy of the soldiers, the nurses, and the gratitude they shared remains etched in history. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a powerful reminder that even in the most harrowing of circumstances, humanity can still prevail.